Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our March 17th session with Agile Hartford. Once again, here's your board. Steve, Larry, Janet, Vin, and myself. Vin wasn't able to join us this evening. After we get finished tonight's event, you'll have a survey. It's probably queued up already. Should hit your mailbox about 7:30 or so. Please take the time to fill in the survey. And I'll admit, with all these remote meetings, I'm even starting to miss those food comments on the survey. So if you want to put one or two of those in there, I won't mind. That'll be cool. Where to find us? We are on the website. You can find us out there, agilehartford.org. The best way to get us is agilehartford@gmail.com. And then we're on all the social medias, and Vin's out there chasing those down for us. I want to thank Eliason again for sticking with us and being our sponsor through all these events. And Rich, I know you're out there.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. Absolutely. And as I've just, said a few times in the pandemic, just it's awesome to continue the collaboration in the community here, that Agile Hartford brings to the Agile folks here in the Hartford market and beyond. So just, always excited to partner with you guys. And, I know most of you know of Eliason Group, but in case you don't, we're a consulting and talent solutions partner with expertise, helping our clients throughout all phases of their Agile journey, Agile transformation. So, if you are working with a company and going through an Agile transformation, we'd love to hear from you. If you are an Agilist and looking for, for consulting engagements, love to hear from you as well. So, but thanks again, guys, and just again appreciate the partnership that we have with you. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Rich. Okay, I have a new crazy harebrained idea. So, we've had the podcast that's out there. We did that. It says our learning something new in 2020 because we needed something else to do. We're trying to find new things to put out there in the world. And I thought I'd try to crowdsource it. So I want to start going to this community, excuse me. I want to start going to this community and see if there's people out there with some idea, maybe something that's missing, something they think people should be paying attention to that they're not. There's lots of podcasts out there with the same old, but maybe if you think somebody's missing a point on culture, there's something crazy with the tools we're using, or maybe these frameworks have become too complicated. You've got other ideas. We'd love to talk to you about those. So shoot us a note, me, Steve, or Vin. You can hit us up at the Agile Hartford Gmail, or just direct message in LinkedIn. Let us know what your idea is. We'd love to get some airtime for you and put you out there in the universe somewhere. So look forward to anybody sharing your ideas. And for our events, we start pursuing. These aren't being pursued. These are all locked in, aren't they, at this point?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll have Alex come to talk to us about working agreements in April.
So hold on. That's not true. April and May are flipped.
Oh.
My bad.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. I thought we updated that. All right, so April will be Lee with Gemba metrics for product owners.
Right.
So we'll get this updated before we post that deck back out there
Mm-hmm.
to the website. Okay,
And
thank
that's
you.
open for registration right now. If you go to Eventbrite or agilehartford.org, you'll see the link to sign up for the April meeting.
April meeting with Lee on Gemba metrics.
Yes, sir.
And then in June will be Eric doing the Okalola games. And I got that right because I'm not having a stout. Otherwise I would have got it wrong. So I wanted to share this slide because I saw this a couple months ago pop up on LinkedIn. And I got so excited when we saw, Janet's coming to speak. And I knew she was on this visual of pioneer women in Agile. Yeah. And this is a whole slide of people that have made it a little bit easier for all of us other people coming after they blaze the trail a little bit. So we appreciate you for that. So our guest tonight is Janet Gregory, and she's an Agile testing and process consultant with Dragonfire with over 20 years experience in multiple roles in Agile development. programming roles, testing, consulting, coaching. Janet's a co-founder of the Agile Testing Fellowship, which was created to grow a community of practitioners who care about quality. And she's a major contributor to many communities and publications, a keynote speaker, and has literally written the book on testing, or maybe 3 of them. I think Janet's work's really allowed a lot of us to understand that quality is like the entire team's problem all the time, not just a single person's problem at the end of a process. So it's absolutely a joy, Janet, to introduce you tonight.
Thank you. All right, my turn to share my screen.
Yes, please.
All right, can you see it okay?
Yes, we see it.
You got it.
Perfect. Person never really knows whether it's there or not when you're sharing, other than the little note that says you are screen sharing. So thank you for that introduction. It was quite lovely. And I love that graphic too. When I saw it, I went, oh, it's so nice to be thought of part of that community. Because when I looked at it, I went, no, I'm not, but I remember my first conference, Agile conference, and I think it was 2002. And I remember meeting Mary Poppendick at the time. And I was just in awe that I was, it's just, that was a long time ago, just about 20 years ago, scary. Anyhow, get back to building quality into DevOps with the Agile Testing Quadrants. Now, hopefully you folks aren't tired to death of listening to the quadrants, but it's kind of I'm just going to bring a little bit of a different focus. And this is, I don't need to say anything else because I think you said it all. I don't need to say anything else. Now, today, there's 2 major parts to this talk. I'm going to take you through a very short intro about DevOps, continuous delivery and deployment to make sure we're all on the same page in terminology. And then I'll look at the evolution of the testing quadrants to show how we've kind of adapted them as the world changed. Then I'll kind of go into, because I'm sure that I always find some people that have never seen them before. Explain it just a little bit, but I want to show you how to apply them to your pipelines and tell you some of the benefits that could come out of it. And then, of course, I have full intentions of ending early enough so that there's time for questions. So please write them down as we go along. I like to start with a quote. And this one, I'm always doing that which I cannot do in order that I may learn how to do it. Picasso, right? To me, this means pushing yourself, thinking differently today, maybe than I did yesterday, trying something new. When Lisa and I started looking at this idea, this talk I'm doing today, we struggled a little bit, wondering whether it made sense. But as we started working on it and really thinking about it, we realized that we were learning ourselves. And I think that's a good thing, just pushing yourself, push the edges. So DevOps, when some companies transition to Agile, they forgot about the operations team. Every team I've ever worked on, right back in 2002, 2001, the operations team was part of it. We thought about it, but so many teams did not. And so that's where DevOps really helped to bring it to the light to say, hey, let's bring those operations people into our team, to the table. I still find that some companies think it's about the DevOps team, the DevOps tools, but really it's about the whole team. And that includes operations, the business, everyone, right? I think DevOps is really about removing the silos, all of them. And that's when we can actually start talking. That's when that whole team can really create understanding, which is what shortens the cycle. Keeping those changes small, that's where the continuous delivery and things come in, that is, it helps us to release frequently, and it just makes sense. But it's a cultural change. It's a shift in how we think. We build it, we run it, we own it. And to me, I think that makes all the difference in the world. It's no more throwing it over the wall, not to testing, but not to operations either. When we think about a quality focused DevOps culture, we start thinking about the whole delivery team, but how to involve people into our releases, and get even like the customer working together to consider the quality attributes of our product. The risks when we test, right? What we're trying to do is mitigate those risks, but there's lots of other ways to do that as well. So also being able to experiment safely. It's important to be able to do it safely. And thinking about where to test, what makes sense to test and where. What should we automate? What should we use our critical thinking skills for? And all those things are really part of it. Now, continuous, this definition is by Jez Humble and Dave Farley, but continuous delivery is the approach for those short cycles, right? We could choose to deliver the software anytime, or we could release it at any time, but the team, including the business, gets to choose when. Continuous deployment is a little bit different. It's basically the same thing, but deploying to production with every single code check-in. Doesn't mean it gets released to the customer with every single code check-in. So things like feature toggles, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we want to reduce the risk. So if we look at a couple of pictures, when we visualize our pipeline, and if you haven't, please do, because then you can start thinking about the actual steps that need to happen. So in this one, for example, the blue is the automated steps. The yellow requires human intervention, human-centric activities, right? But we can visualize what the difference is, which ones are automated, which ones are testing, which ones enable testing. So visualizing it really helps us start to talk about it as well. This is pretty much the same kind of idea, but it's continuous deployment. So we need to, I guess, extract the human-centric steps from the automated pipeline so that we don't have to wait for a human to do something. You know, each step triggers the completion of the next one. I think that there will always be human-centric testing and other things, but we have to figure out how to make it work with our pipeline and how that works. Every team will be different. So now we have, we know a little bit about continuous delivery. I'm sure most of you already did. And the DevOps makes sense. As I was saying in our chatting before, when I listen to a lot of the DevOps people and the continuous delivery people, they make it sound like everybody is doing it, but that's not what I see. It makes complete sense, but a lot of people are still struggling. You're thinking, we'll never get there, right? We struggle to get our testing done in 2 weeks. How are we ever going to get to continuous delivery? So let's kind of talk about testing and what it means. So this is where I'm going to get into the quadrants now. So 2009, this diagram is from our first book, and I'm not going to go into details yet. I will in a bit, but it was the brainchild of Brian Marick. He first showed me in 2003, and it really stuck with me from a testing perspective. What I want to bring attention to is that Brian, when he first talked about these quadrants, on that left-hand side, he said supporting programmers. Lisa and I changed it to supporting the team because we felt it was more than the programmers. Mary and Tom Poppendick had added the little clouds saying which was automated, which was manual. And we really liked that, so we incorporated it. In 2014, in our second book, we dropped the tools off our quadrants because the waters were getting really muddied about what could be automated, what couldn't. We were changing things. We also renamed that left side again because that supporting the team caused lots of confusion. So we called it guiding development, which actually has made much more sense and helped people. We added connectivity to the bottom left quadrant so that people would know that there's more than unit tests in that quadrant. And we also, in that quadrant 4, the bottom right quadrant, we added the idea of quality attributes to make it a little bit more clear what we meant by ilities. And then again, in our last book, which is out, Agile Testing Condensed, we came up, just change it slightly, right? Adapted. And I'm going to talk about the models or the model a little bit more here. So the left-hand side, guiding development, is about tests that are done before you start coding. The ones on the right-hand side are tests that critique the product. So I have it, I can hold it, I can see it, I can look at it, I can listen to it. I critique it, I evaluate the product. Coding has been complete. The left-hand side is more abstract, right? It's guiding development. So when we think about that, if our focus is on the left-hand side, we are trying to prevent defects in code. If our focus is on the right-hand side, we're trying to find the bugs, right? Because the code exists. We need both. But we really want to kind of try to do more about preventing, way cheaper. The top half is business facing, which really means that the business, if they looked at our tests, they could see them, they would understand what they are. The bottom half, technology facing, would mean that they're technical in nature. The business might care about the results, but they'd never go look at the tests. So, for example, unit tests or performance tests. The numbers in the quadrants are purely for ease of use. No other reason. It's not about which one goes first. Absolutely not. But it's so much easier to say quadrant 1 or Q1 than to say technology facing tests that guide development. Quadrant 2, business facing tests that guide development. Quadrant 3, business facing tests that critique the product. And the last one, technology facing tests that critique the product, right? What the examples that we have in here are really that, examples. And again, because of the changes in technology, we've adapted. We felt that we needed to call out the idea of testing in production. So we added monitoring and observability to Q3, although we still try to figure out whether it should be in 4 or maybe in both, I don't know. We also added recoverability specifically to deal with continuous deployment. It's always been important to certain areas, but we called it out very specifically. Now, I want you to do something for me. In the chat, bring up my chat so I can see what's happening. So in the chat, I'm going to have you think about this because it's much easier to listen than actually think about it. So pretend we're building an app to accept donations for, I don't know, a local homeless shelter. And we're going to use Stripe for payment. So we don't actually have to deal with collecting the money. I want you to think about what kinds of testing we might need. For example, we may want to have some unit tests for testing the payment functionality and mock out the external payments, right? But what kind of, think about the different quadrants and what kind of tests we might need to do. So put your ideas in the chat and take a guess at what quadrant you might put them in. So it's just a web app, right? We're just gonna kind of collect money, let donors make payments. What kind of testing might we have to do? I'm gonna give you a minute or two. For sure, security, because we're collecting money. UX in quadrant 2. Accessibility, performance, security. Those are those ilities, quality attributes, so they'd be in 4. However, accessibility could be in quadrant 3 as well, depending on how you do it. Usability, where would that go? That's always a good one. Yeah. Connectivity in 1, yeah. What about your functional tests? Is there any kind of functional tests? Testing the behavior of the system? Quadrant 3. So functionality, quadrant 3. Remember, if we do our tests and write them first, they belong in quadrant 2. If we write them and execute them afterwards, so they're not guiding development, they're in quadrant 3. So it's kind of about what the purpose of the test is. It's a hard exercise thinking about it. Responsive testing. I don't even know what responsive testing is. Can somebody tell me what responsive, you can unmute yourself. Tell me what responsive testing is, because I do not know what that means. Security, 3 or 4. It depends on how you do it, yes. Vulnerability testing. Nobody wants to tell me what responsive testing is. All right, thanks. So I do encourage teams to kind of do this with the team, with your own team. Try to take a blank sheet, but first of all, just take your tests. What are all the tests that you run? And try to figure out where they fit in the quadrants. That might help you decide where you want them to be. Should they be in quadrant 3, or could we make them part of quadrant 2? So just a little exercise for teams to do. It also, because there's some real power behind it. We call it a thinking tool, right? If people are collaborating with it, one of the real benefits I see is that it gets a common language. For example, integration tests. That's one I usually get. And I go, what kind of integration? What do you mean? Are you talking infrastructure integration? Are you talking component integration? Are you talking module, system? There could be lots of different types of integration. So it helps to get a common language if you do it with your team. When you visualize something, it really helps the team to get that shared understanding. I also believe that it helps emphasize the idea of whole team testing, because quadrant 1 is mostly for the programmers. It's testing that they mostly do. Quadrant 2 is business, testers, the programmers, if they're helping with things like simulations. So there's lots of different aspects to that. Quadrant 3 tends to be mostly testers and business people, but I see more and more programmers starting to do exploratory testing. So that's a good thing. And then quadrant 4 is kind of a real mix, depending if you have specialists doing performance or load testing or security testing, but always kind of thinking about how can we bring it back to the team? How can we get us thinking about, say, security early so that we can put some of that in with the programmers? And so you want to be talking about, do we have the people, skills to do what we need to do? I also, when I talk about story done, I think about it, so story done, feature done, release done, right? A release has many features, features have many stories, depending on how you develop. But story done, what is the minimum tests we need to do to get story done? Right? We always say coding and testing, but what kind of testing? And so the quadrants can help that. So what do we need for feature done? So an example that I often use is user acceptance testing. We may not want to do it on every story, but we surely want to do it on every feature. And we definitely have to do it on every release. So you can help define what you mean by story done, feature done. Oh, that's a mistake. What I want to, it's just an empty blank. What I want to do is go through the quadrants with a little bit of a different twist, but talking about risk and the testing activities applied to DevOps and continuous delivery. So once the code is written, we want to automate as much as possible. So quadrant 2, if we start with that, business-facing tests that guide development. We want to be thinking about the risks from a business perspective, right? We have the functional requirements, of course, but do we think about the error handling? What about other ones like third-party integration? Can we identify what to test and automate for, say, contracts, the API level testing, or workflows? Could we start identifying how are we going to reduce some of those risks by exploratory testing, right? We might even start talking about logging. What do we need to have for instrumenting the code? If we think about quadrant 1, these risks are probably more technical in nature, right? Things like maintainability or catching errors as early as possible. Maybe we start thinking about our logging, instrumenting our code. Maybe we think about the security and what can we do in the code to reduce security risks. Quadrant 3. Again, these are mostly business risks, right? Many teams choose not to deploy to production, but have an environment where they can do exploratory testing just to give that little extra confidence. It will depend on the risk that you're trying to mitigate. But there's always the risk that we don't know what the customer really wants until they do it, right? So that's when we start looking at that testing in production, watching what the customers are doing. Can we observe the events and features and see what's going on? Maybe do some chaos engineering to test the resiliency of the system. I'm not going to talk about chaos engineering. Chaos engineering, you can look that up and read about it after if you don't know that. But we want to learn from what maybe the telemetry that we've actually instrumented. And then quadrant 4, these are the quality attributes. I like to think of these as constraints on the system. So what are your biggest risks? For example, if you roll out a feature and it didn't go like you thought it should, how do you handle recoverability? Do you roll it back? Is your process robust enough that you can do that? Or is you have a really good process so that you can get the fix out immediately? Again, the quadrants are a way to think, to identify testing needs, but you can look at them from a risk perspective as well. Now let's think about the planning towards a pipeline, the actual pipeline itself, because we need that pipeline. That's what makes continuous delivery possible. Even if you have a pipeline and you say, well, we don't have any automation and we don't have this, draw your pipeline, take big sticky notes, take big index cards, take something and start drawing your pipeline. Put a sticky note up and say, here's our local environment. We've got this. Everything else is manual, but write it out so people understand. I find that so many times we just don't get it. We don't know where build and merges are happening. We don't know what's happening. So draw it out, and because there's so much involved. Again, there's the technical tasks, right? Making sure that we can do all the things. Do we even have the learning? Do we have the skills on our team to be able to do that? And sometimes it takes a lot of thinking, a lot of experimentation. So, we want to be talking about that. So we talked about risks a little bit, but we want to think about those mitigation strategies as well. Testing has always been a way to mitigate risk, but we can do it a lot of different ways. I think by using techniques as, say, risk storming, gets the team understanding some of the risks, and that's what we're trying to do. One of my favorite questions to product owners is, what is the worst thing that can happen? Because that is likely your biggest risk. And you need to think about, how are we going to mitigate that, right? How are we going to do it in the small chunks? Because that's what we want to do. So feature toggles, I mentioned them before. They let you turn on a feature or hold on to a feature, I guess would be a better way to say it, until you have the confidence to turn it on for the customer, right? Some teams use the idea of blue-green environments to do extra testing. So they're exactly the same environments. Your blue one is production and your green one is an exact copy. It mimics, but your customers see the blue environment and only your team sees the green environment. As soon as you think that it's ready to go, you flip the switch. Green becomes production and blue becomes the test environment, right? Pre-prod, stage, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of teams do that. And that's a great way to mitigate risk as well. There's so many techniques, to try to figure it out like that. There are sometimes risks that you cannot control or mitigate, which is why we want to monitor, which is why we want to observe. And that's why that testing and production becomes so important, to get that feedback from your customer. You need to know what those risks are, and are you willing to wait and see? And that's a question worth asking. Are we going to try to get rid of every single impact before we put it into production? Or is this one okay? We can let it go out and see what happens. So teams have to think about that. And the quadrants just help you to talk about some of these things. If we take the quadrants and apply them to a pipeline, so this is a color coding kind of magic thing, right? Yellow is the quadrant 2. Blue is the quadrant 1. Green is the 3, and red is quadrant 4. So, and I know this is a very simplified example, right? But you could see how thinking about which tests you need to run can be transferred to thinking about when they need to run and in which environment they need to run. So if we think about the infrastructure that goes into the pipeline, right? So years ago, probably 10, 15 years ago, I worked with a test infrastructure team. So we had the testers that did all the functional testing with each of the teams, but we had a separate infrastructure team specifically to test the infrastructure and how it worked with the new releases, with the new features. These days, we don't need that so much anymore because we can spin up test environments and bring them down just as easily. And that's really what we need when we say infrastructure as code. That code can be kind of kept in the same version control as the application code. So if we think about this, right, the local test environment, the developer's PC or whatever they're using for developing, they're going to run their unit tests. They could do their static analysis there. They can start using test doubles, which is just another word for mocks or fakes or stubs, whatever your favorite word is, right? You check in and it goes to your continuous integration and it'll run those unit tests again with everything else. You can run maybe some of your API tests, maybe all of them, depending. Then you start running in the, what have I got next? Development environment. So maybe an automatic push, we do smoke tests. If that all triggers, we start to get into the functional, and that's where the green is. So blue is what tests do we want to run really early? Because that's technical risk. And then the green ones start to get into the business risks. Those are the Quadrant 3 tests, right? And we have to think about Quadrant 4. So it's orange and red. It's looking a little bit different there. But the security, the performance, those are the sorts of things we want to be thinking about. And so when is it? Do we need separate environments for each of these? Or can they all run in the same environment? But it's worth the conversation to talk about it, to think about it. Now, if we take it kind of another step forward and we start thinking about more than just the pipeline, but what other kinds of things do we have to consider? You know, of course, always with a focus on testing from my perspective. But say we're planning to go from releasing every 2 weeks to releasing twice a week. How are we going to do that? How might they brainstorm? So maybe when we start thinking about the tests that we need to do, maybe we start thinking about how do we get there, right? So maybe we have to, so Quadrant 1, maybe we have to say, you know what, we better get better scripts to send back faster feedback. Maybe we have to refresh a test database because we've added new data. Maybe we have to, you know, do something else. Maybe from a Quadrant 2 perspective, the business facing. Maybe we want to start thinking about defining SLOs, so service level agreements, SLI, service level indicators. Maybe we need to start thinking about what that will mean. Maybe we need to really think about our whole pipeline design. When are we going to do stuff? Quadrant 3, we've got our people. Do we have to train people in exploratory testing? Because it's got to go so much quicker. We can't just leave it to the end. What are we going to do? How are we going to evaluate those SLIs? Do we have to train people in how they're going to figure out whether it's running or there's an issue? And so you can start taking it one step further, mapping the tests and what we want to do to what do we need to do to get there. Again, it's a thinking tool. What's going to help us build and configure our infrastructure? And what's going to help us use that infrastructure once it's in place? always thinking with a testing focus, because to me, I really think that's what testing's all about. So I'm going to have a little harder exercise for you. I'm going to go back to the quadrants. Think about them. So we've got this, we're still doing this generic donating money, but we've got automated tests, and we already have a cloud-friendly continuous integration tool. What other kinds of things do we need to do to move to continuous delivery? What would help us get there? What kinds of things do we think? So think about the quadrants. And then just, if you've got any ideas, just put them down in the chat. Let's see what kind of ideas we can get. If you could think of the quadrant, that's cool. But mostly think about the testing kinds of things that might need to be there. And how would we get there to get continuous? I'll give you a minute or so. Think hard. This is a hard one. Yeah. Regression, accessibility. Yeah, how do we get accessibility built in? Are we going to do it manually? How are we going to, or do we going to have some of both? And integrated testing. Yeah, how are you going to get that integrated testing? Yeah, so it's easier. Say, okay, so I'm going to question. Somebody just said, run the automated tests as part of the CI. What happens if you've got automated tests that are taking 4 hours to run? Do you want them part of the CI? Yeah, choose them as a smaller subset, right? So these are things to start thinking about, right? Maybe we start scheduling them out at different times. Maybe we start thinking about what's the most important stuff to run. Maybe we can think about things that go a little longer and they can run on a separate environment. Yeah. So these are the sorts of things we want to start thinking about. So how are we going to get there? By saying we're just going to run the tests? Too easy. Break it down. Ask that. How are we going to get there? What does this mean to us? Okay. On the test string code check-in, yeah, well, definitely the unit test for sure. Absolutely. And maybe some of the others, but again, you have to take into consideration the risk, how fast they run, what do they touch, are they run on a deployed system, or can we run them under the covers, headless? There's a lot of things to think about, right? Smoke tests, where are you going to put the smoke tests? What environment should the smoke test go on? What do you think? What environment should the smoke test run under? Smoke test run in production. Where would you? It's too late running it in production. That's I want to find out first, way earlier than that. QA. Maybe I want to run no earlier than QA. Maybe I want to run it on the development environment, right? So have these conversations, talk to people. What makes the most sense for you? What risks are you trying to mitigate? It comes down to that simple thing. All right, let's kind of wrap up with this. I'll talk a little bit about some of the benefits and finish it off. So it's all about the communication, shared understanding of what risks we need to mitigate, what our deployment pipeline should look like, what needs to be in our runbook so everybody knows what to do with a problem at 3 a.m., right? The whole team approach is really about building a test strategy. And that will include automation, because that's really the only way you're ever going to get continuous delivery. But also, what are the human-centric tests that we need to think about, and where are they going to fit? Helping everybody learn skills like exploratory testing, or maybe performance, whatever is needed. We all have different perspectives. Developers come from implementation. Our business people come from business perspective. Testers hopefully kind of bridge the gap sometimes, but there's more than those perspectives. We each have our own unconscious bias, right? And so by working together, we help prevent that. And there's probably a lot, we have a better understanding, so therefore we will have a better chance of preventing those unknown unknowns, right? We can't guess them all, but if somebody has a different perspective, they can ask the question and we'll go, yes, makes sense. So include everybody, your programmers, your site reliability engineers, if you have them, your testers, your designers. Think about it from a big picture perspective. Get all of those perspectives. And just to kind of wrap up, what we want to do is we want to widen our thinking. We want to prevent our blind spots. We don't want unpleasant surprises. We want to help build faster feedback loops. So this is a diagram that I drew. It was inspired by the We Test Here continuous testing by Dan Ashby. And I'm still thinking about, there's a couple of things in here that I want to change, but for now it's good. But when we think about getting a new idea, right? We brainstorm a new idea, it's a feature or something, we do some discovery, we start testing ideas, and that's really what we've been talking about today, is kind of discovery, having, being able to think, but with, by using something like the quadrants, it helps to focus that brainstorming, it helps to focus those ideas. And then we test those ideas, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And then we code and we build and we integrate, and it goes into that right-hand side of the loop where we just deploy and we release and we learn, right? We observe, we learn things, and then it feeds back in to those new ideas, right? And so it's a continuous loop. And I think we need to think about testing very much as that. It's when I hear things like shift left, shift right, I'm afraid that people think about it as a linear line. And if we shift left too much, we're going to end up with big upfront requirements again. Shifting right is that whole testing and production, but somewhere there's an in-between. And I think this continuous loop, the infinity loop, solves that idea. There's no heavy on this side or heavy on that. It's just a continuous loop that we want to kind of address. So we want to be confident, and that's our goal. Everybody who's moving towards continuous delivery or continuous deployment, we want those changes. We want them to be valuable, of course, but we want to be confident that they're going to be successful. So we want to be using anything that we can to think about holistic, a healthy approach, if you like, to deploy those small changes, to be able to release them with confidence, safety, right? And I find that continuous delivery is still new to most teams. And sometimes we have to step back and look at some of those basics before we go forward. So sometimes you're lucky to have somebody on your team that knows about it and will go off and build all the tools and do stuff, but be very, very careful that they don't leave the rest of the team behind, because it's really important that the team knows what is happening, that the team knows what is being tested where, that the team knows exactly what is happening. Otherwise, you're going to have things that fall through the cracks because there's misunderstandings. So it's that balance, right? And that's where I'm going to leave you. I just want to kind of mention as well that we've adapted the quadrants, and I kind of took you on that little journey, but there's other teams that have also adapted them in different ways. And so in the next slide, I'll just go to that next slide, that you can download. So chapter 8, if you go to agiletester.ca, chapter 8 is the different models on the quadrants and how people have adapted them. I think it's absolutely marvelous. Unless they take and throw away the basic premise of what they are, then that's not so wonderful. But most people have chosen to change things a little bit to adapt to the environment they're in. And I think that's important. And then, of course, we've got chapter 23, testing in DevOps. You can download as well. They're both from our second book. One other book that I mentioned earlier, and I'll just put it in the chat. Where's the chat? Is Practical Testing for Testing. Can't spell. For DevOps by Katrina Clokey. And that's a wonderful book too. So there's lots of resources out there. And the final slide is just to say, if you have any questions and you think of something tomorrow, please send me an email or find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. And with that, I'm going to stop the slideshow and open it up for questions. All right. There.
How do you get everybody involved in the testing, the business, the developers? Well, the QAs are going to be involved, but you know, it's one thing to ask them, but it's another thing for them to provide input.
I think it starts small. Sometimes if you start small and they start thinking that way, they get into the spirit of things. So a question, I'm back to you to make sure I understand. Are you asking how to get them to test or how to think about testing?
Both.
Both. Okay. So getting them to think about testing is, if we're talking about a new feature in our backlog refinement meetings or story readiness meetings, whatever you call them, I will take and I'll say, let's do some mind mapping. Now let's think about testing for this feature. And we'll just start doing some mind mapping. I find that is a very simple way. Spend 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and you start getting people thinking about testing. And that's a great first step. To get them to actually do the testing is share the pain. Don't let them move on to anything else until that story is done, including all the testing, right? If you've got regression testing and it's manual, talk to the team and get the team to say, you know, and it's got to come from the team. We are all going to do regression testing before we put this out. The developers can't move on. Share the pain, because that is the only way that you're going to start getting more traction on automation and start getting them to think about testing first. Does that help?
Yes, that helps. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
So much a question, a visualization, I guess. I don't know if I think it's a combination of you talking about the class you taught in Japan and then that diagram. But when you show that, I guess I never thought about it being a flow. and then you kind of talked about it like this, and it felt very much like Tai Chi or something. And that very deliberate, slow, continuous, I don't think I've ever thought of it as that. I think I've always kind of visualized it more linear when you talk about shifting left. Not shifting left, then shifting right when it's appropriate, and shifting back again.
Yeah,
So
that's why I'd like
I
the,
appreciated that visual.
thank you. Yes. Yep.
Uh,
Because we tend to
I-
do linear.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to QA the notes, but I can't find that book by Katrina Clocky.
Katrina, it's on Lean Pub.
Ah,
You have to go to Lean Pub, Eric. It's not on like Amazon or something like that.
Sorry
Gotcha.
about that. Yeah, it's on Lean Pub. And if you Google it, it'll come up, I'm sure. But yes.
sorry, I went straight to the big A.
Yeah, no worries. No
We all
worries.
do.
There's more and more of us moving to Lean Pub all the time.
I thought it was interesting. Like we never talk about, shift right testing. That was kind of a new concept for me. It's been shift left,
Mhm.
shift left, shift left for so long. And now but it makes more sense taking this holistic view of when does it make sense to do this type of testing? Maybe it does make sense to do it, shifting right. So I thought that was a great perspective.
Yeah, I think you need both, right?
Yeah.
Because you cannot think of everything beforehand. You
Right.
can't.
Like you said, it's a balance. I mean, it may be find the appropriate time. And that's really what, makes the most
Exactly.
sense. You want to be
Yes.
efficient about it.
And it's about risk, right? So if you were developing software for a heart monitor, for example, you might not want to be testing in production so much, right? You might want to do way more mitigating the risk. You'd still want to monitor all that stuff, but you're not going to be so, if I was doing a website that had content only, right? Not much risk there. I can wait to find bugs in production, and as long as I can fix them fast, maybe that's okay. So it's discussions teams have to have, and I don't think they are.
Agreed. Any other questions? I think we have time for one more.
I think I always struggle. I want to piggyback off of Josephine's first question. And I think you said this at the very beginning, Janet. It's a cultural movement.
Mhm.
And I think that's where we always get stuck. So we're so anchored to our roles and our functions. I don't know if you have any tips on how to start that. It's almost like a revolution in the culture, but that's we seem to get stuck on those things that require that.
I never thought about it as a revolution, but maybe a little bit. I like to go in and stir the pot a little bit sometimes, but yes. But it is, it's getting people to think differently. And so it starts with each individual person, right? I cannot, for example, change your mind. No matter what I do, no matter what I say, I can't make you think differently than you do. But I can start with me on how I respond to certain things that you say or do. So, for example, I was just had a chat with a friend of mine the other day, and she was almost in tears because somebody come and said to her, "How come you missed that bug? How come it got into production?" And it starts with you saying, "You know what? I'm not taking that monkey. This is not my monkey to take." To say, "You know what? Let's go talk to the team. Hey team, how did this bug escape from us, right? How did we let that happen?" And I think that that's how it starts changing and it doesn't happen overnight, right? But by slowly changing the way people look at things, and it starts with yourself. How do you respond to certain things? What language do you use? Do you use language like saying the QA team? Because as long as you say the QA team, they are separate. If you say the tester on our team, they are part of that team. refer to a community of testers if you're in a large organization. But as long as you keep referring to them as a QA team, they will always be separate. So stop doing that. It's sometimes little pieces of language that makes a huge difference in that cultural change.
Those are steps we can all probably take. Thanks for that. That's awesome.
It's harder than you think because it's really easy. You get in a habit, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So every time there's not very many questions, I have two thoughts. Either everybody hated it so much that they have no questions, or, which is the one I choose to think, is I was just so good, so articulate that they've got no questions to ask. It all starts with a person.
No, for me, it's the latter. I'm still digesting this. I mean, it was very eye-opening.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Janet, I do have a question, but not necessarily about your presentation, but looking over your shoulder, I see your billboard or whatever for Agile Testing Fellowship. What is that?
So Lisa and I, in 2017, I guess, I've been teaching a course called Agile Testing for the whole team for 10 or more years. But I was the only one doing it because Lisa works full time. And I was getting too many requests and I just got to the point where I couldn't do as many. So we decided to get other instructors and things. So we created the fellowship and now we've got instructors all over the world. We couldn't do it before because there weren't enough people that had the skills, that had a good testing background, that had experience in Agile and were good facilitators. And it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years that people like that have been coming up. And so now we've got this really nice group of people that are teaching the course all over the world. And so the fellowship is the community that we're trying to create with people who've taken the course or have the same kind of ideas of what we mean by Agile testing. So that's what the fellowship is.
And what is the course that they're teaching?
Agile testing for the whole team.
Oh.
So it's how do we get testing into the team? How do we make it part of what everybody thinks about? So it's not for testers, it's for programmers and product owners and the team, the whole team, including testers.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. Mostly that's
I've seen those stickers around before too. And I noticed the mule we know from Lisa's presentation because they were actually in her presentation. So the dragon must be your spirit animal.
Yeah, exactly. It's a donkey. It's a donkey, not a mule.
Donkey, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
that's right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
A donkey, yeah.
I'm glad she wasn't here to hear that. I think I might have made that mistake that night too. And I got the eye. So
yeah, and the dragon is my company name is Dragonfire. I'm a fantasy buff. One of my favorite series is the Dragon Riders of Pern. Friendly dragons, not the Game of Thrones kind of dragons, but friendly dragons. So yes, my spirit animal is such.
Awesome. Well, as we wrap, so everyone, you should have a survey in your inbox about tonight's event. So we're always interested in hearing your feedback. As Dave mentioned, also, if you have thoughts for a future podcast, we'd love to hear them. We'd love to work with you and see what we can do to extend our messaging to the community. And please also be sure to sign up for April. And Janet, it was a pleasure having you. This was a fantastic presentation, very informative, very useful. So from Agile Hartford and all of our community, thank you very much.
You're so very welcome. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Janet.